Welcome to War Bios, the podcast where we delve into the most pivotal battles in history, and I'm your host, General Biography. Today, we're going to explore one of the most decisive conflicts of the American Revolutionary War, the Battle of Saratoga, fought in 1777. This battle was a turning point in the war, marking a crucial victory for the Continental Army and convincing France to ally itself with the Americans. It's a story of strategic brilliance, tactical innovation, and the human cost of war. In the summer of 1777, British General John Burgoyne, a seasoned commander with a reputation for bravery and cunning, launched an ambitious campaign to split the American colonies and force a negotiated settlement. His plan was to march his army of over 7,000 troops south from Canada through the Hudson Valley and meet up with a secondary force under General William Howe, who would be advancing north from New York City. The goal was to control the Hudson River and effectively cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. As Burgoyne's army began its march, it was a formidable force, consisting of British regulars, German mercenaries, and Canadian militia. They were well-trained, well-equipped, and confident in their superior numbers and firepower. However, the terrain they faced was daunting. Dense forests, steep mountains, and treacherous rivers that would slow their progress and stretch their supply lines. Meanwhile, the Continental Army, under the command of General Horatio Gates, was gathering its forces in the Hudson Valley. Gates, a veteran of the British Army, had been appointed to lead the Northern Department, and he was determined to stop Burgoyne's advance. He began to assemble a diverse force of troops, including militia from New York, Massachusetts, and Vermont, as well as regulars from the Continental Army. One of the key players in the Continental Army was Benedict Arnold, a brilliant and fearless commander who had already made a name for himself in the war. Arnold was instrumental in rallying the militia and preparing them for battle. He worked tirelessly to fortify the American positions, using his knowledge of the terrain to create a series of defensive lines that would funnel the British Army into killing zones. As the summer wore on, Burgoyne's army faced numerous challenges, including treacherous terrain, sweltering heat, and harassment from American skirmishers. Despite these obstacles, they pressed on, driven by their commander's determination to reach Albany and link up with Howe's forces. However, as they approached the town of Saratoga, they began to encounter increasingly stiff resistance from the Continental Army. The armies were gathering, the terrain was treacherous, and the stakes were high. It was here, in the rolling hills and forests of upstate New York, that the Battle of Saratoga would unfold, a battle that would test the mettle of both armies and change the course of history forever. In the days leading up to the battle, the Continental Army was busy preparing its defenses, digging trenches, and building fortifications. The Americans had chosen a strong position, with the Hudson River to their east and a series of hills and ridges to their west. They were determined to hold this ground, knowing that if they could defeat Burgoyne's army, they would deal a crushing blow to British strategy. Burgoyne, meanwhile, was growing increasingly concerned about his situation. His supply lines were stretched thin, his troops were tired and hungry, and he had yet to hear from Howe, whose support was crucial to the success of the campaign. Despite these challenges, he remained confident in his army's abilities and was determined to push forward, convinced that a decisive victory would bring the Americans to the negotiating table. As the days passed, the tension between the two armies continued to build, with both sides engaged in a series of skirmishes and probing attacks. On September 13, 1777, Burgoyne's army emerged from the forest and began to deploy on the outskirts of Saratoga, their movements carefully observed by American scouts and skirmishers. The British commander was determined to test the American defenses, and he ordered a series of reconnaissance and force missions to identify weak points in the Continental Army's lines. One such mission, led by Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum, a German officer in British service, set out on September 13th to scout the American positions and determine their strength. Baum's force consisted of about 600 troops, including Brunswick Dragoons, British light infantry, and a company of Loyalist militia. As they approached the American lines, they were met with fierce resistance from a detachment of Vermont militiamen, who had been posted on the high ground to the west of the main American position. The ensuing battle, known as the Battle of Bennington, was a decisive defeat for the British, with Baum's force being routed and the German officer himself mortally wounded. The American victory was a significant morale boost, and it helped to reinforce the confidence of the Continental Army in their ability to withstand a British attack. Meanwhile, Burgoyne's main army continued to deploy on the outskirts of Saratoga, with the British commander determined to launch a full-scale assault on the American positions. On September 19, 1777, the British army emerged from the forest and began to advance on the American lines, their movements screened by a thick fog that had rolled in overnight. As the British troops approached, the Americans held their fire, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was not until the British had reached the crest of a small ridge, about 200 yards from the American lines, that the Continental Army opened up with a devastating volley of musketry and artillery fire. The British were caught off guard, and they stumbled backward in disarray, leaving behind many dead and wounded. The battle raged on for several hours, with both sides trading volleys and counterattacks. However, the American position was too strong, and the British were ultimately forced to retreat back into the forest. The first day of the Battle of Saratoga had ended in a decisive victory for the Continental Army, with the British suffering heavy casualties and their commander's plans in tatters. As the sun set on September 19th, Burgoyne's army was in disarray, with many of his troops wounded or missing. The British commander himself was increasingly isolated, with no sign of relief from General Howe, and his supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Despite these challenges, Burgoyne remained determined to push forward, convinced that a decisive victory would still be within his grasp if he could only break through the American defenses. The Continental Army, buoyed by their success on September 19, was ready to deliver the coup de grace, with General Horatio Gates, the American commander, ordering his troops to prepare for a final assault on the British positions. As the British Army regrouped and reassessed their situation, Burgoyne's options were dwindling rapidly. With his supply lines stretched thin and no sign of relief from General Howe, he knew that a decisive victory was his only hope for escape. On October 7, 1777, Burgoyne launched a final assault on the American positions, hoping to break through the Continental Army's defenses and make a dash for Albany. The British attack was fierce, but the Americans were well prepared and held their ground. As the battle raged on, General Benedict Arnold, who had been instrumental in the American victory on September 19, led a daring charge against the British right flank, shattering their lines and sending them into disarray. The British army was now in full retreat, with Burgoyne's men fleeing in panic towards the safety of their camp. As the dust settled, it became clear that the Battle of Saratoga had ended in a crushing defeat for the British. Burgoyne's army was trapped, surrounded by the Continental Army, and with no hope of escape. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army, marking a decisive turning point in the American Revolutionary War. The consequences of the Battle of Saratoga were far-reaching and profound. The defeat convinced France to ally itself with the Americans, providing significant financial and military support that would prove crucial in the war's outcome. As historian Edmund Morgan observed, the Battle of Saratoga was the first great victory of the American army, and it marked a turning point in the war, for it showed that the Continental Army could stand up to the British in a pitched battle. Today, the Battle of Saratoga is remembered as a pivotal moment in American history, a testament to the bravery and determination of the Continental Army. The battlefield itself has been preserved as a National Historic Park, with monuments and memorials commemorating the sacrifice and valor of the soldiers who fought there. It marked a turning point in the war, a moment when the tide of history shifted irreversibly in favor of the Americans. That's all for today's War Bios. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, I'm General Biography reminding you to keep marching toward victory.